The boy in my arms was 5 years old and burning so hot I could feel the fever coming through my dress, through my own skin, like holding a coal wrapped in a christening gown. If he died before sunrise, they would say the slave girl killed him. If he lived, they would say the doctor saved him. I was 17 years old. I was a widow. And I was the only living soul in that whole great house who knew how to walk a child back from the edge of a fever. Which is exactly why I could not understand that night why the master could not bring himself to look at me. He stood in the doorway with his son dying in my arms, and he looked at the floor, at the window, at his own hands, anywhere but my face. I found out why 3 weeks later. He had already sold me. He had shaken hands on it and taken the money. He just had not told me yet. But that is the end of the story, and I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how a 17-year-old girl came to be holding the most precious thing that family owned on the worst night of their lives, while carrying a secret that would break my own heart in the spring, you have to understand 3 true things about the world I was born into. On a great many plantations across Virginia and the Carolinas, the person who kept people alive was not the white doctor. It was an enslaved woman. Across the American South, medicine in the quarters was women's work, and it was old work. Enslaved healers, herb doctors, and midwives carried knowledge that had crossed the ocean in memory, when everything else had been stripped away. African healing traditions braided together over generations with what could be learned from native plants and European folk remedies. A grandmother taught a mother taught a daughter, and the lessons were spoken, never written, because writing was forbidden. They knew which barks brought down a fever, which roots settled a stomach, which leaves drew the poison from a wound. They caught the babies. They sat with the dying. On plantations that might see a paid physician only a few times a year. They were in plain fact the whole of medicine. And here is the part that history has been slow to say out loud. They were often better at it than the trained white doctors of their day, because the fashionable medicine of the 1850s was a brutal business. When a white physician arrived, he was likely to bleed you, open a vein and drain the blood he believed was making you sick. He would dose you with calomel, a mercury compound, until your gums bled and your teeth loosened, and call that a cure. He would raise blisters on your skin on purpose. This was called heroic medicine, and it killed a great many people who might have lived. A gentle herbalist with a willow bark tea and a cool cloth, and the sense to let a body rest was, more often than the record likes to admit, the safer person to have at your bedside. The second true thing is about time. How little of it enslaved people were given before grief found them. Enslaved people married young, though the law recognized no such marriage. A wife or a husband had no legal standing at all and could be sold away from their partner at any moment for any reason or none. So a girl might be a wife at 15 and a widow at 17, and think nothing strange in it because loss came early and often, and there was no insurance against it anywhere. The third true thing is the one that governs everything else, and it is the cruelest. It is that skill did not save you. Loyalty did not save you. Love did not save you. An enslaved person was property, and property is sold when a debt comes due. After the United States banned the importation of enslaved people in 1808, a vast internal trade rose up to replace it. Over the decades before the Civil War, roughly 1 million human beings were carried from the Upper South, from Virginia, from Maryland, from the Carolinas, and sold into the Deep South to the cotton and the sugar, in what the enslaved called being sold down the river. Families were shattered on the auction block as a matter of routine business. A man might sell the woman who had nursed his own children through the fever, not out of hatred, but simply because the trader came through in the spring and the mortgage was due. And because the more valuable she was, the better the price she would bring. Sometimes being irreplaceable was the very thing that put you on the block. Now hold those three things together. A girl who could heal. A girl already acquainted with loss. And a world where being needed could not keep you safe. Her name, the name I have given her because she is not in any record book, I invented her. Her name is Delia. Everything that threatens her was real. The fever, the doctor's poisons, the traitor in the spring. She was not real. But she could have been 10,000 women, and every one of them real. So let me take you back to the boy burning in her arms. And let her tell it. Because it was always her story to tell. I want to start before the great house, before the fever, back in the quarters. Because that is where I learned everything that mattered. And it is the part nobody in that family ever thought to ask about. My grandmother's name was Effie, and she was the finest doctor for 20 miles in any direction. Though not a soul on this earth ever called her doctor. They called her Granny Effie, and they called her at all hours, and she went. I was raised at her elbow. Before I could read a clock, I could read a fever. The dry kind and the wet kind, the kind that breaks on its own, and the kind that means you had better not sleep. She taught me the way her granny taught her, with her hands and her voice and no paper anywhere, because paper was against the law for us and memory could not be confiscated. She would walk me out past the tobacco at first light with a sack over her shoulder, and she would name the world into my hands. Willow bark, she would say, peeling a strip and folding it into my palm. You boil this for the fever and the aches, and it works, child. It truly works. Do not let anybody tell you the old ways are foolishness. Bone set for the deep fevers, the ones that rattle the bones. That is why they call it so. Slippery elm for a throat closed up tight. Horehound and mullein for the chest. Onion and mustard mashed warm and laid on the ribs to pull a cough up and out. She taught me to make a sick child drink when the child wanted only to sleep and slip away. She taught me that half of healing is refusing to leave. You sit, she said. You sit and you do not quit on them. And sometimes that alone is the medicine. I saw her prove it once and I have never forgotten it. I was maybe 12. A woman 2 cabins down, her name was Rilla, went into her labor early, and it went wrong. The baby turned the wrong way and she bled, and by the middle of the night the other women had stopped meeting each other's eyes. Which is how you know in the quarters that they have given someone up. Granny Effie did not give her up. She worked over Rilla for hours with her hands and her herbs and a low steady voice that never once let on how bad it was. Turning that baby by touch alone in the dark. Packing the bleeding with a poultice her own granny taught her. And all the while talking to Rilla like they had all the time in the world. Like nothing was wrong at all. Stay with me now, girl. Stay right here with me. And when the gray women in the corner had already started their grieving, Granny Effie brought that baby into the world alive and screaming and stopped Rilla's bleeding and sat with her till the sun came up to be sure. Afterward, walking home, I asked her how she had known Rilla would live. She stopped in the path and looked at me and said, I did not, child, you never know. You just do not quit on them before God does. That is the only piece of it that is ours. That was the whole of her doctoring. Right there in the path at dawn. Everything else was just bark and root. The medicine was the not quitting. Granny Effie died the winter I was 16 in her sleep, which is a gentler death than most of us got, and I was glad of it even as it broke me. And just like that, with no ceremony and no choice, I became the one they came to. 16 years old and the whole quarters looking at me the way they used to look at her. I was terrified. I have never told anyone that until now. I was so afraid I would let somebody's child die because I was not her. I married Amos that same year. I will not spend long on Amos because it still costs me too. But you should know he existed because the family in the great house never once knew I had been a wife. Amos was tall and slow to anger and quick to laugh. He worked the timber down by the mill, and he called me his little doctor and meant it kindly. There was a way he had of coming in from the timber, at the end of a day, filthy and grinning, and standing in the door of our cabin just looking at me like I was something he had wanted forever. I would tell him to quit it, and he never would. We had one summer. We used to talk in the dark the way young married people talk about how maybe someday, some way, we would be able to buy ourselves free, save it up coin by coin over 20 years, 30, and have a little cabin somewhere that no one could sell out from under us. It was a foolish dream, and we both knew it, and we talked about it anyway because you have to have something to say in the dark. The next winter a lung fever took him. The wet kind. The kind that means do not sleep. I sat with him and I did everything Granny Effie ever put in my hands. The bone set and the mullein and the onion on his chest. And I did not leave him, not for 4 days. And it was not enough. He died with his head in my lap in the gray hour before dawn, still trying at the very end to make it easy on me. Whispering that it was all right, that I had done everything, that I was not to blame myself. Comforting the doctor right up until he could not anymore. So when I tell you I know what it is to have all the knowledge in the world in your 2 hands and watch it not be enough, I am not saying it to move you. I am saying it because it is the thing I carried into that great house the night their boy took sick. I already knew that healing is not a wall against death. It is only a fight you are sometimes allowed to win. I had been a widow for 4 months. I was 17 years old, and I thought I had already met the worst thing that could happen to a person. I was wrong about that, but not in the way you would think. The fever came to the quarters first. It always did. It came for the children first, too, which is the particular cruelty of that kind of sickness. It goes for the small ones, the ones with the least to fight it with. It started with the prior baby, then the 2 cold children. Then it moved down the row like something with a mind. A hard fever and a throat swelling shut so that the little ones fought for every breath. I knew it the moment I saw the first one. I had seen it in Granny Effie's time. It killed. It killed a lot. So I did what she taught me. I did not quit. I moved cabin to cabin through the cold with my sack over my shoulder the way she used to. I boiled the willow and the bone set. I made slippery elm gruel thin enough to slide down a closed throat. I propped the babies upright so they would not drown lying down. I taught the mothers to steam them over a pot to open the breathing. And I sat, God, I sat. I went 4 nights nearly without sleeping. And I want to tell you plainly because it matters to what came after. I lost 2. A cold child and the littlest prior. I laid them out myself. There is no bark and no root on this earth for the fever, and it is already too deep, and any healer who tells you different is a liar or a fool. But I saved 9. 9 children, who are the whole reason I can bear to have lost the 2. I will tell you about the littlest prior, because I owe it to her not to let her be just a number. She was 14 months old, and her mother, Suki, was younger than me by a year. A girl with a baby, the way so many of us were. I fought for that child 2 full days. I did everything. And on the second night, the fever took her anyway, in Suki's arms. And there was a moment right after where Suki looked up at me, with a question on her face that I will carry to my own grave. A question that was not even angry, just lost. You are the doctor. Why did you not fix her? And I had no answer because there is not one. I had to be the one to take that baby's weight from her arms and lay her out. And then, this is the part I need you to understand about that life. Then I washed my hands in the cold water, and I picked my sack back up, and I went to the next cabin, where the Hollis boy was choking on the same fever. Because the dead cannot be helped, and the living still can. And Granny Effie taught me you do not get to stop and fall apart until the fever does. I saved the Hollis boy that same night, not 2 hours after I laid the prior baby down. I have never known how to feel about a night like that. I do not think there is a right way. You just carry both of them, the one you lost and the one you kept. in the same set of hands for the rest of your life. Nobody in the great house knew or cared what was happening in the quarters. 2 dead slave children were a line and a ledger to them, if that, right up until the morning the fever climbed the hill and walked in their own front door. It came for the master's children the way it comes for all children, without asking whose they were. There were 3 of them. Miss Ada was 8, sharp-eyed and bossy, and my favorite before I ever had the right to have a favorite. Little Toby was 5, and the baby Charlotte was not yet 2. Toby went down first, then the baby, then Ada, all inside 3 days, all with the same hard fever, and the same swelling throat I had been fighting at the bottom of the hill for a week. They sent for Dr. Merrill. I need you to picture Dr. Merrill, because he is half of everything that happened. A florid, important man with a leather bag and a gold watch and a way of filling a room with his own certainty. He came, and he did what the finest medicine of the age instructed him to do. He bled little Toby, opened a vein in the arm of a 5-year-old who was already weak as water, and let his blood run into a bowl. He dosed all 3 of them with calomel until their mouths went sore. He raised a blister on the baby's chest on purpose, and they got worse. Of course they got worse. You drain the strength out of a sick child and call it a cure. I knew all this from the kitchen, where the house folks whispered, because it was not my place to know anything. I was a field and quarters girl. I had been up to the great house maybe twice in my life. But Aunt Phoebe, who ran that kitchen, had watched me work the fever at the bottom of the hill. And on the 4th night, when Dr. Merrill had gone home to sleep, and the master's boy had stopped taking water, and started that hollow, plucking breathing that I knew too well, Aunt Phoebe did a dangerous thing. She went to the mistress and she said, "There is a girl." They brought me up to the great house at 2 in the morning. I had never been in a room like that child's room. There was a carpet. There were toys enough for a whole row of cabins. And in the middle of it, in a bed too big for him, was Toby. 5 years old, gray around the mouth, working for each breath like it was a load he could not lift. His mother, Miss Cornelia, sat by him with her face gone to pieces. And the Master Ashby, stood in the doorway. And that was the first time he looked at the floor instead of at me. "Dr. Merrill says there is nothing more to be done tonight," Miss Cornelia said, and her voice was a threat. "He says we should pray." I looked at that boy, and I forgot entirely whose boy he was. I want to be honest about that, because later it would matter a great deal. In that moment, he was not the master's son, and I was not anybody's property. He was a child who could not breathe, and I was Granny Effie's granddaughter, and there is only one thing you do. "Get me a pot of boiling water," I said, "and a blanket, and every onion in that kitchen, and do not let that doctor bleed him again." I heard my own voice say it. Do not let that doctor bleed him again. To white people, in the middle of the night. And I braced for the blow. It did not come. That is how frightened they were. Fear had made them able to hear me. I worked on that boy until dawn. I steamed him under the blanket over the pot until the tight thing in his throat began to give. I got willow bark tea into him a spoonful at a time, holding his jaw, making him swallow when he wanted only to quit. I laid the warm onion and mustard on his chest to pull the cough up. And I did the last thing Granny Effie taught me. The thing Dr. Merrill with all his gold and his Latin never learned. I did not leave. I sat and I held him upright against my own chest, so the fluid could not settle and drown him. And I did not quit on him hour after hour. And somewhere in the grayest part of the night, his breathing loosened and deepened, and he slept, really slept, the healing kind, not the slipping away kind. By the time the sun came up, his fever had broken. Miss Cornelia put her hand over her mouth and made a sound I will never forget. And Master Ashby, in the doorway, finally looked at me. One look, quick and full of something complicated I did not have a name for yet, and then looked away again. I did not understand that look then. I understand it now. It is the look of a man watching the woman he has already sold reach into the fire and pull his son out of it. They did not send me back down the hill. For 11 days I lived in that great house, which no field girl ever did, and I fought the fever for all 3 of those children at once. Toby and the baby Charlotte, and then Miss Ada when she went down hardest of all. Dr. Merrill was sent away. I heard later he was furious. That he told the master it was a disgrace, a scandal, to turn his children over to a slave's kitchen witchery. That if one of them died, it would be on Ashby's head for choosing a field girl over a physician. And the master, to his credit or his desperation, told him to get out. He did not stay gone, though. Dr. Merrill came back on the 3rd day, and I was there for it. Because I was carrying fresh water across the front hall when his buggy came up the drive, and I heard the whole thing through the open door. He was not a man used to being sent away, and he had had 3 days to work himself into a lather about it. He came up onto that porch, and he told Master Ashby that the whole county was talking. That Ashby had turned his own children, his white children, over to the kitchen superstitions of a field slave. And that when one of them died, and one of them surely would, it would be Ashby's name attached to the disgrace, not the girl's. He said the word witchcraft. He said it was an insult to his profession, and to the natural order both. And then he made his mistake. He said, send the creature back to the fields where she belongs, and let a white man save your son, or do not and answer for it. There was a silence. I stood very still in that hall with the water jug in my hands, because I understood that my life was being decided on the other side of that door, and I had no vote in it, the way I never had a vote in anything. And Master Ashby said, quiet, tired, but I heard every word. My son is breathing Merrill. He was not when you left, he is now. I do not much care who the natural order says did it. And he told the doctor to get off his porch. I should have been grateful. Part of me was. But even then, some cold, clear part of me knew that a man who will keep you because you are useful is not the same as a man who thinks you are a person. And that the first kind of man will turn on you the day you stop being useful. I filed that away. It turned out I was righter than I knew. So it was me. 11 days and 11 nights, mostly with Aunt Phoebe helping and Miss Cornelia never leaving her children's side. The worst of it was the baby. Toby had turned the corner and Ada was holding her own, but Charlotte, not yet too small to have much to fight with, went down into the deep part of the fever on the 7th night. And for a few hours, I thought she was the one I was going to lose in that house. Her throat had closed to almost nothing. She had stopped crying, which anyone who has tended a sick baby knows is the sound you are most afraid of. Not the screaming, the quiet. She had gone limp and gray, and her breath came in that shallow flutter like a moth against a window. The flutter that means the door is open and the child is standing near it. Miss Cornelia felt it too, and started to come apart. So I did the thing Granny Effie did for Rilla in the dark all those years ago. I put a wall of calm in my voice that I did not feel anywhere in my body. And I said, she is not going anywhere, Miss Cornelia. Look at me. She is not going anywhere. And I got to work, and I did not let myself believe otherwise. Because a healer who starts grieving early has already quit, and I would not quit on that baby. I steamed her over the pot until the steam ran down with her sweat. I worked slippery elm gruel between her lips a drop at a time with my finger, patient as dripping water for hours. I kept her upright against my shoulder and walked the floor with her the whole night. Back and forth across that carpet, tapping her little back to keep the fluid from settling, singing low the songs my grandmother sang, songs that Great House had surely never heard. And I did not sit down, and I did not stop. And somewhere in the last black hour before dawn, that baby coughed. A real cough, a strong one. The tight thing in her throat finally tearing loose. And then she cried, loud and furious and alive, the most beautiful ugly sound I ever heard. And Miss Cornelia burst into tears at the noise, because we both knew that a baby with the strength to scream like that was a baby who would live. I handed Charlotte back to her mother as the sun came up. My arms had gone numb from holding her all night, and I had not even noticed. That is 3. 3 of them walked back from the edge one at a time with these 2 hands. I want to tell you about Cornelia, because she is the other half of everything. I had every reason to hate that woman. She had never once in her life thought about me, or any of us at the bottom of the hill. But grief is a great leveler. And over those 11 nights bent together over the same sick children, something happened that neither of us asked for. She watched me work. She watched me do for her children the things a mother does. The sitting up and the singing low and the refusing to leave. And I think she understood, maybe for the first time in her whole protected life, that the woman doing it had once done it for her own. That I knew this fever so well, because I had buried children to it. My own people's children at the bottom of a hill she had never walked down. One night near the end, with Ada finally cool and sleeping between us, Miss Cornelia looked at me across that little body and she said, "Quiet, you have lost people to this." Not a question. I said yes. She said, "Children?" And I said, "Everybody I ever sat with was somebody's child, Miss Cornelia." She did not say anything to that. But she reached across her sleeping daughter, and she took my hand and held it for just a moment. And there were no such thing as a master and a slave in that grip. Only 2 women who had been to the same terrible country and come partway back. And Miss Ada, my sharp-eyed, bossy Miss Ada, the morning her fever broke, she opened her eyes and found me sitting there, and she said, cross as anything, "You are still here." Like I had been keeping her waiting, and I laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. And she decided, in the way children decide things, that I belonged to her now, and she would not be argued out of it. I should say something honest about that, because it is the kind of thing these stories usually leave out to keep things simple. The love a child like Ada gives you is real. It is also crooked, and you never get to forget the crookedness of it, even for a minute. She loved me the way you love a thing that is yours. Because in the only law she had ever been taught, I was hers, or her father's, which came to the same thing. She could love me with her whole heart, and still grow up to own people. And there was no contradiction in it for her. Because nobody had ever taught her there was one. And I let her love me anyway, and I loved her back, God help me. Because she was 8 and bossy, and had nearly died in my arms twice. And you take the love that is offered, even when it comes wrapped in something you cannot ever fully forgive. That is one of the 100 small daily impossibilities of a life like mine that a free person never has to solve. You love the children of the people who own you, and it is genuine, and it is a chain, and it is both of those things at the very same time, forever. And there was the strangeness of where I was living. For those weeks, I slept on a pallet in the great house, ate from the great house kitchen, walked on carpet, and every night, some part of me stood at the window and looked down the hill toward the quarters, toward the row where my own people were, where Amos was buried, where Granny Effie was buried, where I belonged and would always belong. The house folks up top did not quite trust me, a field girl resined too fast. The quarters folks down below did not quite know what to make of me anymore either. I had saved white children, and there is a complicated feeling in that, for people whose own children the same white folks would sell without blinking. Not blame exactly, but not simple pride either. I was suspended between 2 worlds that both half claimed me, and neither of which was mine. I had never in my life felt so useful and so alone at the same time. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I would be back down that hill soon in my own place among my own dead. I was righter than I knew about being sent somewhere soon. I just had the direction wrong. All three of those children lived. Not one of them died. I did that. I want to say it plainly one time without shrinking from it the way we were taught to shrink. I did that. I should have been the most valuable person on that whole plantation. I was. That was the trouble. Stay with me here, because this is where it turns and I do not want you to miss it. Here is how I found out. It was 3 weeks after Toby's fever broke. The children were mending. I had been kept up at the house until they were strong, Miss Cornelia said, sleeping on a pallet outside the nursery, which was the softest sleeping I had ever known, and I hated every minute of it, because it was not mine and I knew it. I was coming back from the kitchen garden after dark with a basket of the last herbs, and the study window was open, and I heard the master's voice, and another man's I did not know, and I heard my own name. And I did the thing you are never supposed to do. I stopped. I stood under that window in the cold with the basket in my arms, and I listened. The other man was a trader, a speculator working the Virginia plantations, buying up people to march south to the cotton markets. The spring coffles, the ones that went down to Natchez and New Orleans and were never heard from again. His name was Slade, and they were finishing a piece of business that I slowly understood had been agreed on months before. Back before the fever, back in the autumn, Master Ashby was in debt. The tobacco had failed 2 years running, and there was a note at the bank he could not cover. And back in the fall, he had made an arrangement with the trader Slade to sell off several people in the spring to settle it. And I was on the list. I had been on the list since October. A healthy girl of 17, no children to complicate the sale, and Slade's voice through the window in the dark. Skilled, worth a premium, worth more than most. I stood there and I could not breathe, and there was no fever in me to blame it on. You understand what I understood standing under that window. I had not saved his children before he decided to sell me. I had saved them after. The whole time I was holding Toby against my chest through the night. The whole time I was steaming the closed throat open and refusing to leave. I was already sold. The handshake was already done. Every hour I spent pulling his children back from death. I was a woman he had already promised to a man who would march me 1,000 miles from everyone I had ever known and sell me to the cotton. That was the look in the doorway the first night. That was what I could not name in it. It was not cruelty. I almost wish it had been. Cruelty is at least simple. It was shame. He could not look at me because he already knew what he was going to do to me, and he was watching me save his son anyway. He tried to speak to me about it once. Only once. It was a day or two after I overheard, and I think he could tell something had changed in how I moved through his house, though he could not have known I knew. He found me alone in the hall, and he started to say something. Delia, I want you to understand that a man in my position, and he got that far, a man in my position. And then he looked at my face, and whatever he saw there stopped him cold, because I did not drop my eyes the way I was supposed to. I looked straight back at him, a 17-year-old girl looking a grown white man dead in the eye, which could have gotten me whipped. And I said nothing at all. I just let him look at the person he had sold, and he could not finish his sentence. He never did tell me what a man in his position was owed or forced to or forgiven for. He just stopped and turned and walked away, and we never spoke of it again. I have thought about that a great deal over the years. That in the end I never had a scrap of power over that man except one. And it was that I could refuse to make it easy for him. I could decline to be comforted about my own sale. It was not much, but it was mine, and I used it. I am going to tell you what I did next, and I am going to tell you honestly. Because there is a version of this story where I become a saint, and there is a version where I become a monster, and the truth is I was only a girl trying to decide what she owed to whom. For one whole night, I decided I owed them nothing. I lay on that pallet outside the nursery, and I thought, let the fever come back, it could. These things circle round, and if it does, I could simply do less. I could be a little slower with the willow tea. I could sleep instead of sit. Nobody would ever know. Who could ever prove what a slave girl failed to do in the dark? He was going to march me to Natchez in the spring and sell me to the cane. Why should his children have breath in their bodies when he was about to tear mine out of everything I loved? I thought about it. I want you to know I truly thought about it, because anybody who tells you they would not is lying, and I am done with lies in this story. And then I thought about Granny Effie. Not what she taught me about medicine. What she taught me about myself. You do not quit on them, she used to say, and she did not mean it was a rule for good girls. She meant it was the one thing they could never take. They could take my labor and my husband and my grandmother, and now my whole life march it south and sell it by the pound. But the deciding of who I was, the choosing to be a person who does not let a child die when she can stop it, that was mine. The only thing that was ever fully mine. If I let them turn me into someone who would smother a child in his sleep to spite his father, then they would not just be taking my body south. They would have finally gotten the rest of me too. And I would go to the cotton, not just enslaved, but emptied. Having handed them the last free thing I had, I decided that Master Ashby could sell my body if the law let him. But he could not have my soul, and he could not make me into the thing he had made of himself. So no, I would not do less. If the fever came back, I would fight it with everything Granny Effie ever put in my hands. Not for him, and not even really for the children, but for me. For the one thing about me that no bill of sale could ever transfer. That is not saintliness. That is the opposite. That is the most selfish thing I ever did. I saved those children to save myself. The fever did come back, by the way. These things circle, like I said. About 10 days later, a second wave moved through, and this time it caught Miss Ada worse than anyone. My sharp, bossy Ada, who decided I belonged to her. It went straight for her chest, and it was uglier than the first round. And there was a night in there, just as bad as the babies had been, where I sat with Ada burning against me and did the arithmetic in the dark. This is the child of the man who sold me. If I let go, if I sleep, if I am just a little less than everything I know how to be, no one will ever know, and he will have earned it. And I sat there with that thought, honestly, for a while. And then I fought for her like she was my own, 3 nights running. Willow and Boneset and Steam and the not quitting. And I won her back a second time. Not for him. I want to be exact about that, because it is the whole meaning of the thing. I did not save Ada for her father, who deserved nothing from me. I saved her because the alternative was to let him reach all the way down into the middle of me and turn me into something small and poison. And I would not give him that. He had bought my body already. I was not going to hand him my soul on top of it for free. Every hour of that fight, I was a woman who had been sold, doing the one free thing left to her, and knowing exactly, coldly, freely, that that was what I was doing. Spring came the way it always comes, without any regard for what it was bringing with it. I knew the date. I had heard it through the window. The trader's sleigh would come back the second week of April with his wagons and his chains to collect the people Master Ashby had sold and march us south. I counted the days like a woman counts anything she cannot stop. The dogwood started to bud. I remember hating the dogwood for being beautiful on a schedule that was carrying me to the auction block. And here is where I have to tell you the truth instead of the story you might want, because I promised you I would. I did not escape. There was no wagon in the night, no run for the river, no Union man on a horse. That war was still years off, and I was one girl in the middle of Virginia with nowhere on this earth to run to. What happened was smaller than an escape, and in some ways stranger. And it turned on Miss Cornelia because Miss Cornelia found out. I do not know how. A slip, a servant. The trader's business getting loose in the house the way business does. But about a week before April, she found out that her husband had sold the girl who had saved all three of her children twice, and had known he was going to do it the whole time. And Miss Cornelia, who 3 months before had never once thought about me, walked into that study, and from what Aunt Phoebe heard, took the roof off the house. I never learned everything that passed between them. I know it went on for days. I know the word disgrace got used, and this time not by Dr. Merrill. I know Miss Cornelia said she would not sleep another night under the roof of a man who would hand the children's own. She did not have a word for what I was to them, and neither do I to this day. To a speculator to be worked to death in the cane. I know that a marriage is its own kind of ledger, and that a wife who has just watched her 3 children nearly die has a kind of power in a house that even a husband's debts cannot fully answer. And I know that when the trader Slade came the second week of April with his wagons and his chains, my name had been struck off his list. Others went. I have to tell you that too, because it is the part that is easy to leave out, and it is the part that matters most. The wagons were not empty. The debt was still the debt, and it got paid the way those debts always got paid. In people. When the master kept me, the number he owed the bank did not change. It just landed on somebody else. And one of the somebodies it landed on was Suki. You remember Suki? The girl a year younger than me whose baby I could not save at the bottom of the hill, who looked up at me with that lost question on her face. She had had no more children since, which in the cold arithmetic of a trader's ledger made her an easy sale. Young, healthy, no little ones to lower the price or slow the coffle. So when a space opened on Slade's list, because Miss Cornelia had fought to keep me, it was Suki's name that slid into it. I stood at the top of the hill in the April morning, and I watched them chain her in. I watched the coffle form up. 30, some people I had known my whole life roped and shackled wrist to wrist in a long line. And I watched it turn and move off down the road toward the south. Toward Natchez, toward the cotton, toward a place none of them would ever come back from. Suki looked back once. I do not know if she was looking for me. I have never let myself decide whether she knew, whether she understood that she was walking that road partly because I was not. I lifted my hand. I do not know if she saw it. That is the whole of why I was spared. Not justice, not mercy. An arithmetic. A healthy girl for a healthy girl. One name struck off and another written in. That happened this one time to land in my favor, and on Suki's neck. I have carried her down that road in my mind every day of my life since. You do not get to be glad you were saved when you know the shape of what saved you. I have never once let myself feel simple relief about that day. I do not think I am allowed to, so I stayed. I lived. I went on being the doctor of that place for years, the way Granny Effie had been the doctor of hers. And Miss Ada grew up bossing me and loving me in the tangled, unequal way those children love the women who raised them. And I let her because you take the love that is offered, even when it comes wrapped up in something crooked. But I want to be clear with you about what I understood standing at the top of that hill watching the wagons carry my neighbors south while I stayed behind. I was not saved. I was kept. There is a difference, and it is the whole difference. A free woman is safe because she is a person. I was safe because I was useful. Because the day I stopped being the most valuable thing on that plantation, the day my hands got old or a better healer turned up, or Miss Cornelia's children grew up and moved away, the spring trader would come again, and there would be no wife taking the roof off the house for me the second time. My whole life was a knife balanced on the edge of my own usefulness. I spent it the way you would spend a life like that, making myself indispensable over and over, year after year, because being needed was the only wall I had, and it was a wall that could come down any season. They called it a kindness, my being spared. It was not. Kindness would have been my freedom, and that was never on the table. What happened to me was that I got to keep my life by making sure they could not afford to lose it. That is not the same as being free. It is just a longer, quieter kind of cage, and I lived in it with my eyes open, and I never once mistook it for the sky. That is where I will leave Delia. At the top of the hill, spared and not saved, watching the wagons go, refusing to call her cage a kindness. I will be honest with you the way she was honest with us. Delia and the Ashbys are inventions. I made them up. There is no grave to visit, no ledger with her name. But I did not invent the willow bark or the bone set, or the grandmothers who carried that knowledge across an ocean and down through the generations by memory alone. I did not invent Dr. Merrill's bleedings and mercury. That was the real ruinous medicine of the age, and enslaved healers really were, again and again, the safer hands. And I did not invent the trader in the spring. Roughly 1 million real human beings were sold from the Upper South into the Deep South before the Civil War, and no amount of skill or loyalty or love was ever for a single one of them a reliable wall against it. Delia's cage was real. Millions lived in it. If her story moved you, go and meet a real woman who lived at the mercy of that same trade and refused to let it own her soul. Read Harriet Jacobs' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written under her own hand about her own life. A woman who fought with everything she had for the one thing Delia understood was worth fighting for. The right to decide who she was even when she could not decide where she would be. It is real. It is in the public domain, and it will stay with you. And do the thing Delia asked near the beginning, the name, the grandmother, the aunt, the woman in your family who knew how to fix things, who people came to in the dark. Say it out loud right now, wherever you are. Because that knowledge, the kind that gets passed hand to hand and mouth to ear, because it is too precious to lose, that is the thing that outlasts every cage anyone ever built. Delia's grandmother is why Delia lived. Somewhere back down your own line. There is a woman who is the reason you are here to listen to this at all. Until then, sit with the people you love and do not quit on them.